Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about sex worker protections. So, this might be a controversial topic for some folks, and I totally get that. The cultural messages we've received about sex work have never been overwhelmingly positive, right? Well, that's the exact reason why I'm hoping even you skeptics will take a few minutes to hear me out. So, what is sex work, anyways? Sex work can be most precisely defined as the exchange of money or goods for sexual services or erotic performances among two or more consenting adults. What are the key words here? Adults and consent. Adults and consent. Thus, sex work is not the same, let me repeat, not the same as sex trafficking. I'm sure many of you listeners are out there rolling your eyes right now and thinking to yourselves, okay, but sex work contributes to sex trafficking. And yeah, to a certain degree, you're right, it does. But that's primarily because of the laws that we've put into place with the intention of helping sex workers. In other words, cultural bias is dictating laws around sex work while we ignore the various ways these laws are contributing to greater challenges, barriers, stigma, and discrimination. For example, most people believe that all sex workers are only engaging in sex work because they have no other options, that they feel trapped, that they'd rather be doing anything else. And that's true of a lot of people, but it's certainly not the case for every sex worker. Believe it or not, it's possible for sex workers to really enjoy their jobs. Some people engage in sex work because it offers flexible working conditions and much higher pay. Still, others pursue sex work to explore and express their own sexuality. Now, regarding those who feel trapped or believe they have no other options, how might our current laws around sex work be more harmful than helpful? Long story short, criminalizing sex work will not stop sex work. No, seriously, you don't believe me? All right. Well, bear with me while I walk you through a similar but different example. Let me ask, how did the war on drugs of the 80s and 90s work out? Well, we are currently, right now, literally, in the middle of the country's largest substance abuse crisis ever, the opioid epidemic. Now let's rewind a bit more and consider prohibition. Need I go on? So, sticking with the war on drugs example, Portugal decriminalized all illicit substances in 2001. Policy changes largely dictate that citizens will no longer be incarcerated for petty drug crimes. Tax dollars are, instead, allocated for recovery options. And guess what? Longitudinal studies regarding the impact of Portugal's policy change indicate reduced drug use among problematic drug users and adolescents, a reduced number of opioid related deaths, reduced incidence of infectious disease, a reduced burden on the criminal justice system, and a resulting increase in the number of addicts seeking plausible treatment. Moreover, reports suggest that public awareness has been positively impacted. Addicts report reduced stigma and incidents of discrimination and report improved feelings of value and self worth. Obtaining help seems viable because there's no longer fear of legal consequences, judgment, or discrimination in the same way. I hope you see where I'm going with this by now, but for those of you who don't, the same philosophy can be applied to sex work. Criminalization seems to have an adverse impact on the desired outcome because it drives the behavior underground. So, right now, I'm going to list several reasons why criminalization is working against us in terms of sex work, and then I'll go into greater detail about my bullet points. Criminalization causes increased violence towards sex workers, especially members of the LGBTQ plus community. It causes an erosion of trust between sex workers, law enforcement officers, and healthcare professionals. It causes limited employment options and financial security following criminal charges, and it causes increased stigma, discrimination, and marginalization. Now, here's why. Because sex workers and clients are cautious about the possibility of arrest, criminalization makes it harder for sex workers to negotiate terms with their clients. New clients, fearing undercover investigations, are reluctant to provide a real name or background information. Thus, sex workers are forced to enter potentially dangerous situations with new clients with very little information. Furthermore, fear of incarceration has effectively silenced sex workers who might otherwise report violence and harassment to law enforcement. Because sex work is considered criminal activity, sex workers become easy targets for abuse and exploitation, such as sex trafficking. Law enforcement is less likely to take reports of a missing sex worker seriously, which contributes to the ease with which sex traffickers are able to poach new victims. Oh, and speaking of law enforcement, sadly, sex workers are sometimes extorted or coerced into sexual acts by police officers who use incarceration as a bargaining chip. As far as health and wellness, sex workers often go without medical care because they fear bias and discrimination exhibited by medical staff. Not to mention the fact that sex workers have no access to employer based health insurance. Oh, yeah, and let's talk about condoms. In certain locations, law enforcement officers are allowed to submit condoms as evidence of intent to engage in sex work. So, many sex workers have stopped carrying condoms, which puts everyone at higher risk of contracting HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. Criminalization also prevents sex workers from working with other sex workers for safety, as working alone reduces visibility and the likelihood of arrest. Conversely, others choose to obtain managers or join brothels, hoping for protection, financial security, and access to bail money. However, these institutions are more often associated with sex trafficking. So, what happens to sex workers after they are arrested? Well, life only becomes way more challenging. Criminal charges, particularly felony convictions, make it inordinately difficult for one to secure gainful employment, housing, state and federal benefits, student loans, and community services. Fines, fees, and costs associated with an arrest exacerbate poverty, which significantly increases a person's vulnerability to trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Finally, all of these factors, which effectively keep sex workers marginalized, only contribute to greater stigma and discrimination. So, right now, you might be asking, well, who the hell are you and why do you care? My name is Lauren Baker, and I've been working in the field of mental health since 2008. I've had experience with a number of populations across a range of settings. I've worked as a victim's advocate and counselor for survivors of domestic violence, a behavioral health tech at group homes for at risk teens. I've worked with the adult SMI population at a number of psychiatric facilities, and I've worked as a case manager and more recently a therapist for individuals struggling with the disease of addiction. In each of these settings, I've spoken with clients who identify as sex workers. They have all shared firsthand accounts of the various traumas that they have endured. I believe it is my duty as a counselor to promote and advocate for the wellness of my clients, so here I am. I want to finish up by providing some resources and counseling tips for my fellow mental health professionals, but really this information could be useful for anyone who wants to get involved with this cause. Community mental health organizations and nonprofit domestic violence agencies offer a wealth of services for individuals who have limited healthcare access. In northern Arizona, where I live, Spectrum Healthcare Services and Verde Valley Sanctuary are two such locations. As we've already discussed, sex workers often experience trauma on multiple levels. As such, recommended models for treatment include trauma-focused and strength-based care. Examples of appropriate frameworks include cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, dialectical behavior therapy, and perhaps most notably, sex worker affirmative therapy, which offers a strength-based and supportive approach to managing the impact of distal and proximal stressors. And of course, get out there and advocate. Contact one of the national and global resources presented on your screen to see how you can get involved. Oh, and don't forget, International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers is coming up on December 17th. I truly hope I've inspired at least one of you to use your voice. Have a great day.